crafty insights about Queen Caroline of Ansbach, the astute matriarch of history. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was a commanding figure in British history, wielding influence that surpassed expectations with her exceptional intelligence. Born into a German noble family amid adversity, her life's journey took her from the courts of Prussia to the regal palaces of Britain, setting the stage for one of history's most intriguing and ruthless family rivalries. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, a commanding presence as the consort of Britain, wielded her power for beyond expectations. Her intelligence surpassed not only her royal spouse, King George II, but also most individuals. Caroline was a mastermind who devised intricate plots, often targeting those within her own family. Join us to discover one of history's most ruthless family rivalries. Caroline's tumultuous family background may have contributed to her complex interpersonal relationships. Born in 1683 into a German noble clan, she faced early adversity. Her father succumbed to smallpox when she was just 3 years old, and her mother passed away when she was 13, leaving her an orphan. Nonetheless, fate had great plans for her. Alone and vulnerable, Caroline found herself in the court of the King and Queen of Prussia, primarily due to her mother's friendship with Queen Sophia of Prussia. Sophia welcomed her as a ward and soon discovered Caroline's exceptional intellect, curiosity, and emerging beauty. This set the stage for a significant turning point in her life. Caroline's aristocratic lineage, captivating beauty, and sharp intellect led her surrogate mother, Queen Sophia, to hail her as the most agreeable princess in Germany. It didn't take long for Queen Sophia to consider a marriage proposal to the future Holy Roman Emperor. However, Caroline's response was nothing short of shocking. In 1705, Caroline faced yet another monumental trial in her young life. That year, her beloved Queen Sophia tragically succumbed to pneumonia at the mere age of 36. The news left Caroline in a deep state of mourning, and she confided to a friend, "The calamity has overwhelmed me with grief and sickness, and it is only the hope that I may soon follow her that consoles me." However, fate had a different path in store for her. Although Queen Sophia had departed, her memory lingered. In June, Prince George Augustus of the House of Hanover, Queen Sophia's nephew, paid a peculiar visit to Caroline's court. Strangely, he arrived in disguise, and his motives went beyond mere amusement. Prince George had a serious mission to court Caroline and secure an heir. Nevertheless, his family's history and marriage matters were plagued by turmoil. The House of Hanover was notorious for internal conflicts, and his father's marriage to Sophia Dorothea of Celle had ended in tragedy. It was rumoured that the patriarch had murdered his wife's lover and imprisoned her for decades, separating her from her children. George saw it essential to investigate Caroline as a potential bride, but he couldn't have foreseen how this would backfire. George's infatuation with Caroline was evident from the outset. He had heard rumours of her incomparable beauty and mental attributes, but her actual qualities exceeded his wildest expectations. He couldn't divert his attention from her. However, Caroline, with her keen perception, recognised his true identity from the beginning. Fortunately for George, she found him appealing and eventually agreed to marry him. Nevertheless, she might have had her own hidden agenda. George's family had firmly established himself in the realm of dysfunction, as evidenced by his mother's imprisonment and estrangement. Yet there was one distinct advantage they possessed. They were next in line for the British throne. While Queen Anne, their distant cousin, currently reigned, her health was fragile, and she had no heirs. Thus the sceptre was on its way to George's father, and eventually George himself. When Caroline agreed to marry George, it's difficult not to speculate that she might have had aspirations for the crown, although she had no inkling of the challenges that lay ahead. Shortly after the wedding, in a modest ceremony in George's homeland of Hanover, Caroline faced immense pressure. Her in-laws were adamant about the urgent need for a male heir. In fact, George's father went so far as to ban him from participating in military campaigns until Caroline was expecting, and the expectation was that their child would be a boy. This was the cost of marrying into a soon-to-be royal lineage, but Caroline had a knack for coming out on top, as she consistently did. Defying societal norms for their era, George and Caroline were deeply in love and had no trouble fulfilling their marital obligations. Consequently, Caroline became pregnant almost immediately, and she gave birth to a son, Frederick, in January 1707. However, what might have been considered a fortunate turn of events in other circumstances became a tumultuous beginning for Caroline. Shortly after childbirth, Caroline was struck down by smallpox and subsequent to pneumonia, teetering on the brink of death. The palace took precautions to keep her newborn son away from her to prevent potential infection, while George, devoted to his wife, remained at her side to nurse her back to health, even contracting smallpox himself. Fortunately, both survived, but it was only the start of a tumultuous journey with little Prince Frederick. And speaking of tumultuous, although George's love for Caroline led him to endure smallpox for her sake, he did not restrain himself to a monogamous relationship. Much like many nobles of the time, George maintained multiple mistresses alongside his marital obligations with Caroline. It was evident because she gave birth to 3 more children, all girls, in less than a decade. However, there's an intriguing twist to the extramarital situation. Caroline of Ansbach was undeniably astute. She knew how to manage her husband's wandering eye. Rather than confronting it, she chose to embrace it, and even encouraged George to discuss his mistresses with her. This way she remained in the loop rather than being kept in the dark. Furthermore, she often employed these women as her ladies-in-waiting, giving her a watchful eye on their activities. Caroline brought stability to George's historically turbulent household, but she was about to face some challenging years. In 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain passed away, and Caroline's father-in-law ascended to the English throne as King George I, with Caroline and her husband becoming the Prince and Princess of Wales. Consequently, Caroline embarked on a sea voyage to England to personally assume her new titles and adapt to royal life. However, there was something she had left behind at home. Queen Caroline Part 2. Upon relocating to England and taking on their new roles, Caroline and George made the heart-wrenching decision to leave their 7-year-old son, Prince Frederick, in the care of his uncle in Germany. Upon their relocation to England and their new roles, Caroline and George brought most of their daughters with them, opting to leave their 7-year-old son, Prince Frederick, in the care of his uncle back in Germany. Perhaps this decision appeared reasonable at the time, but it would be a grueling 14 years before they would reunite with him, among other complications. Caroline, however, was not one to dwell in sentimentality. Instead, she quickly became entangled in British intrigue. Caroline's move to England as Princess of Wales ushered in a significant shift in her life. Since there was no Queen Consort, recall that the King of England had his former wife locked away in Germany, Caroline now held the highest ranking position among women in the realm. The newfound power seemed to go to her head. While the royal family is expected to present a unified front to their subjects, harmonising a group of entitled nobles is no straightforward task. Caroline wasted no time in causing a stir within weeks of her arrival. While King George I was staunchly German, Caroline and her husband were determined to Anglicise themselves, rapidly immersing themselves in British politics, culture and social circles. Regrettably, this did not bode well. Their immersion into British culture, seemingly innocent and benevolent, was in fact a calculated move. They appeared significantly more modern and approachable compared to the austere king, and their popularity soared, likely as Caroline had intended all along. They soon created a full-fledged rival court in direct opposition to the monarch, which greatly displeased King George. The historical House of Hanover dysfunction reared its head again, and tensions escalated to a breaking point. When that breaking point arrived, it was tragic. Amidst these political manoeuvres, Caroline became pregnant once more, but this time the outcome was far from favourable. Following 4 successful pregnancies, she tragically delivered a stillborn son. Those close to her attributed the tragedy to the incompetence of English physicians, and the brewing bitterness within the royal court likely exacerbated matters. Caroline was undoubtedly devastated, yet little did she know that the situation was about to take a nightmarish turn. In 1717, a year after the stillbirth, Caroline gave birth to a healthy boy, Prince George William. Overjoyed at her successful pregnancy, Caroline eagerly prepared for the boy's baptism. However, here she made a rare miscalculation. She had not considered that the royal court was a tinderbox ready to ignite, and it was about to explode in her face. On the day of George William's baptism, King George I, who had likely been waiting the opportunity to retaliate, suddenly took issue with his son and daughter-in-law's choice of godparents. His revenge was merciless. Rather than discussing the matter with them, the king confined Caroline and her husband to the house arrest at St. James's Palace and then banished them from the court entirely. In the aftermath of the baptism controversy, King George I forcibly separated Caroline and her husband from their children, including the newborn, insisting that the infants remain with him while the couple endured exile. It was a cruel punishment designed to underscore who truly held the sceptre and power in Britain, but this time the king had gone too far. During this period of separation, Caroline's worry for her children consumed her, driving her to such a state of distress that she secretly entered the king's palace to visit them. Eventually, King George I couldn't ignore her actions and felt guilty for the anguish that he was causing. He granted her unrestricted access to their infants, but by then the damage had been done. In February 1718, Caroline faced her worst nightmare when her youngest son, Prince George William, fell gravely ill and passed away at just a few months old. The palace even conducted an autopsy to ensure that the separation from his mother hadn't caused his death, and it revealed that he had a heart polyp. However, whatever the cause of his death, it did nothing to improve King George I's popularity or mend his relationship with his son and Caroline. Unfortunately, the hardships continued. Caroline's nerves were undoubtedly shredded to the core by now. In the same year her infant son passed, she suffered a miscarriage due to the shock of a storm while she was at home. The Princess of Wales mourned the loss of her 3rd child, and although she would go on to have 3 more healthy children, she never forgot that King George I was a co-author of her misfortunes. Faced with these challenges, she concocted a ruthless plot, one that would ultimately fail. Caroline was too intelligent to openly declare hostilities with her father-in-law. Instead, she cultivated a friendship with the politician Robert Walpole, seeking to wield real power behind the scenes in the government. For a brief period, it seemed to work. Walpole even orchestrated a public reconciliation with the crown for Caroline and her husband, a mere show of unity to gain more influence and hopefully regain her children from the king. However, things did not unfold as she had hoped. Accustomed to meticulously managing her household and affairs, Caroline learned a painful lesson about her own fallibility through her alliance with Walpole. Unbeknownst to her, Walpole was using her to advance his own political influence. While her efforts to regain custody of her children stalled, Walpole ascended to the de facto Prime Minister of Britain. Empty-handed and frustrated, Caroline needed to find another means to seek vengeance. Ultimately, it came in the most natural way possible. In 1727, Caroline received news that likely brought her immense satisfaction. King George I had been travelling when he suffered a stroke on the road. Although he clung to life for another day or so, King George I of England, and a perpetual thorn in Caroline's side, passed away on the 11th of June 1727. At last, she became the Queen Consort, and her husband ascended to the throne as King George II of Britain. One of her initial acts was to reunite her family, but this act opened a Pandora's box that she never could close. Caroline regained custody of her children, whom King George I had kept away from her. However, she still had to summon her son, Prince Frederick, who had spent the last decade and a half in Germany. As a grown man, Frederick joined the family in England as the new Prince of Wales in 1728. Yet this union was far from joyous. When Caroline laid eyes on her son again, it marked the beginning of troubles. In the years since Caroline had last seen her son, Prince Frederick, he had undergone a troubling transformation. He had become a debauched person, indulging in drinking, gambling, and maintaining several mistresses. Yet the most alarming aspect was not his behaviour. Frederick harboured a deep resentment for his absent parents, and perhaps as a karmic twist related to Caroline's own actions as the Princess of Wales, he swiftly aligned himself with her political adversaries. If only it had ended there. Over the years, Caroline's political astuteness remained as sharp as ever. She even urged her husband to maintain their complicated relationship with Robert Walpole, recognising his substantial influence and desiring to remain in his favour. Starting in 1728, this political acumen paid off handsomely. During King George II's absence, it was Caroline who acted as regent, not her wayward son. Yes, only Caroline of Ansbach could devise a way to solidify her influence and simultaneously slight her son. However, it was a decision that would soon backfire. In 1736, King George II was once again away, and Caroline was serving as regent. This time, things took a disastrous turn. A detractor of the King and Queen posted a note at the royal palace gate, and it read, "Lost or strayed out of this house, a man who has left a wife and 6 children." It marked one of the first signs of unrest against Caroline's sway over George, and the situation was on the verge of escalating dramatically. When King George II finally attempted to return his post in England several months later, a series of misfortune nearly spelled catastrophe. First, his ship encountered a storm, leading to rumours in London that the king had perished. Upon his return, matters only worsened as he collapsed into illness upon reaching his bed. Caroline must have been riddled with anxiety, but her son Frederick saw it as a ruthless opportunity. While Frederick inherited his mother's disdain for the older generation, he had none of her political finesse. Everything he did was grandiose and brash. For instance, Frederick rapidly propagated another rumour that the king had truly passed away, prompting King George II to rise from his feverish haze and prove that he was still alive. At this juncture, Caroline and George recognised that they needed to address their troublesome son. However, their solution would prove to be calamitous. Possibly hoping that marriage would temper her son's behaviour, Caroline had wed Frederick to 16-year-old Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha just before the shipwreck debacle. Yet this union did not quell his rebelliousness. It merely provided him with a new pawn to employ in his efforts to antagonize his parents. At one point, he instructed the naive Augusta to arrive at the chapel after Queen Caroline, forcing her to rudely nudge the consort aside to claim her seat. It was a petty irritation Frederick took great pleasure in. However, his next move would propel this feud to ludicrous extremes. When Frederick's new wife became pregnant, he devised another scheme to exact revenge on his mother and father. As soon as he learned of Augusta's labour, he initiated a ruthless plot. He compelled the princess to undertake a nocturnal journey to a remote palace for the birth of their baby daughter, on a tablecloth, no less, as the palace was unprepared to receive her. Why did he do this? To ensure that his parents would not be present for the birth of their grandchild. When Caroline discovered this, her response was unrelenting. Caroline was no stranger to the realm of familial discord, and despite her horror at Frederick's actions, she managed to deliver a scathing insult of her own. You see, royal births typically had numerous witnesses, primarily to ensure the legitimacy of the child, especially if it was a boy and not some sort of changeling. Upon learning that it was a baby girl, Caroline breathed a sigh of relief and commented that it was a poor, ugly little she-mouse rather than a large, fat, healthy boy. However, her response didn't end with words alone. Attempting to exclude one's royal parents from the line of succession is not advisable, and Caroline and King George II ensured that their son faced severe consequences for his actions. They exiled him from their court, mirroring the same actions taken against them by the previous king. Consequently, parents and son were officially estranged from one another. Remarkably, despite all the preceding tension, the situation managed to become even more awkward. Frederick grew up without a mother's influence, so perhaps he can be forgiven for not fully comprehending the extent of her vindictiveness. Over time, Caroline and George not only openly favoured their younger son, Prince William, but also explored methods to divide the inheritance in a way that would minimise Frederick's share of their holdings. Around this period, Caroline uttered statements that could never be taken back. Caroline's deep-seated animosity towards her son was evident, and she did not hold back her caustic remarks. It is reported that she once expressed, "I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell," or when speaking of Frederick's long-suffering wife Augusta, "Poor creature, were she to spit in my face, I would only pity her for being under such a fool's direction, and wipe it off." Motherhood, particularly with a son like Frederick, clearly did not suit Caroline. It would also prove to be her downfall. In 1724, when Caroline gave birth to her final child, she experienced a significant umbilical hernia. More than a decade later, this condition resurfaced in the most dreadful way possible. Following a formal reception in the winter of 1737, Caroline was in excruciating pain and confined to her bed. Alarmingly, a portion of her intestine had protruded through the old hernia opening, putting her life at risk. This marked the beginning of a period of desperation. King George II's love for his wife remained unwavering, and he implored the royal physicians to undertake a series of treatments in hope of curing her. However, despite various medical procedures, purging and bloodletting, Caroline's suffering only intensified. Recognizing that her end was near, Queen Caroline decided to enact one of her final acts of vengeance. Throughout this period, Caroline's son, Frederick, desperately sought the chance to see his dying mother one last time. Her response was chilling. Directed by his wife, King George II forbid Frederick from visiting Caroline, although the Queen Consort later relented and sent a message indicating her forgiveness. That note likely carried a touch of passive aggression. But soon her demeanour turned downright aggressive. Caroline's last moments on earth were marked by excruciating pain. Her strangulated bowel ruptured on the 17th of November 1737, and she writhed in agony for 4 more days before passing away on the 20th, at the age of 54. Yet there was a parting victory. As attendants prepared to lay her to rest in Westminster Abbey, she remained certain that her son Frederick was not invited to the funeral. Amid her painful demise, Caroline received the love of her husband. King George II reportedly wept by her bedside as she slipped away. When she urged him to remarry after her passing, he protested, stating, "No, I shall have mistresses," to which she retorted, "My God, that doesn't prevent it." When King George II followed her in death 23 years later, he was laid to rest in a matching coffin beside her. Not all of her relationships found such closure. In the end, all of Caroline's conflicts with her son, Prince Frederick, came to naught. Not only had she passed into history, but Frederick did not live long enough to ascend to the British throne. In 1751, at the age of 44, he likely succumbed to a pulmonary embolism, leaving his son, Caroline's grandson, to become King George III instead. Caroline's intellect and curiosity made her one of the most captivating women of her era, and she found herself at the forefront of many 18th century debates and advancements. She corresponded with the renowned philosopher Gottfried Leibniz and held salons for writers like Jonathan Swift. However, her most enduring intellect legacy had a darker side. During that period, medical practitioners were exploring new methods for inoculating against deadly diseases like smallpox. the very ailment that claimed Caroline's father. Caroline supported this research by initially testing the potentially perilous inoculation on condemned prisoners and subsequently using it on her own children, including Frederick. Did it prove effective? Yes. Does it offer some insight into Caroline's parenting approach? Just a bit. Caroline's political and emotional sway over King George II, as well as her role in the family feuds, constitutes her enduring legacy. Her influence was widely recognised during her time, and an uncomplimentary poem remarked, "You may strut dapper George, but 'twill all in vain. We all know 'tis Queen Caroline, not you that reign. Then if you would have us fall down and adore you, lock up your fat spouse as your dad did before you."